one thing I know we have in common is we love the early icons that were made, that were they were the first representations of Jesus looking like we think of Jesus looking. And so they have that the Middle Eastern man look. They have the dark hair, the beard, the mustache. It has those distinctly Jewish features.
Hey, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more of these episodes. As you know, I am the author of the book The Only Witness, which is a Christian historical fiction, and it traces the history of the Shroud over the past 2,000 years. Today, we're speaking with Pam McCue, and she is a longtime researcher and speaker on the Shroud. And her series that she talks about and tries to answer the question, who is the man of the Shroud? And so, with that, Pam, it's so good to have you. We've known each other for quite a while now, and this is your first time on my podcast.
Before we continue, I want to briefly tell you about my new book, The Only Witness. It's a work of Christian historical fiction rooted in years of serious research into the Shroud of Turin. The story traces what may have happened to the Shroud across 2,000 years of history through war, secrecy, faith, and survival. It puts you right into the story. If you're interested in the historical mystery behind the Shroud and its possible journey over the last 2 millennia, you can learn more and order your copy at guypowell.com or on Amazon. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Yes, it's good to be with you, Guy.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us in the audience, what's your backstory on the Shroud? How did you get involved in this?
I'm an engineer, and so there were many years that I didn't look into the shroud. I thought it sounded fascinating, but when the carbon-14 dating came out on it, I thought it probably wasn't worth looking into. And then I saw an exhibit. And the exhibit is by the same folks who put together the exhibit that I have today. It's a group called Athonia. Athonia is the Greek word for linens that was used in the Gospel of John. And so when I saw the exhibit, I knew that there was more to the story, and I started studying it. And then, as you know, Guy, once you start studying it, then you have to talk to people about it. And then that led to me having this beautiful exhibit that I carry around the country.
Yeah, and that is a beautiful exhibit, and it really portrays the whole story of the Shroud, the history and the science and everything. It's a wonderful exhibit, and if in the audience, of course, if you get a chance to see a presentation, well, any presentation, but certainly one that has the Othonia exhibit, it's definitely worthwhile. So tell us, what do you think is the best evidence for the Shroud, especially in the early history?
Yeah, so often you'll hear that the shroud just showed up in France in 1353 or 1355. And I think there is so much great evidence in the early years. And there's a lot of references in text. Some of my favorite references, and most of these come from the 300 to 500 time frame, is image of our Lord and Savior at full length, image bearing icon, full length body image of Jesus, image of God incarnate, image of Christ of divine origin, and my personal favorite, an awesome image of Jesus, which was an object of particular veneration. So just all those references certainly sound like they're referring to the shroud. At least today, that's the only thing that would be similar. But then there's images also. So one thing I know we have in common is we love the early icons that were made that were real. They were the first representations of Jesus looking like we think of Jesus looking. And so they have that the Middle Eastern man look. They have the dark hair, the beard, the mustache. It has those distinctly Jewish features. So, what I love is that if you look into the science of it and compare what we know now of the photographic negative on the shroud to those icons, it's just a dead match. There are so many points of congruence or whatever you want to call the specific points and the angles and the shapes that make up images that it's just a certain match. And what I really love is that there are three things that are very specific to the shroud. And I love to challenge people, go look at this and you'll think about it different after you do. So, one of those features is there's a band around the face, between the face and the hair. You see it on the shroud, and you see it on those on that early icon. And by the way, the best icon to check is the one from St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai. That was really the earliest one that has been traced back, and it was made about 550 AD. So look for that band around the face, which matches the shroud. By the way, researchers think that's probably a chin band that was used to keep the body of Jesus, keep his chin closed in death. And it shows up as a feature in the painting. And then the second one that I'll mention
Well, let
is
me
that
stop you
icon.
there. You have one over your shoulder that you have that Saint Mary's image right over your shoulder.
Yes,
And
yes,
that's
yes.
it.
Will that
That is
show
a
up?
famous image, and that one is so like the shroud, as because it is the one from St. Mary's, which is one of the early images like that.
Yeah, so Saint Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, Egypt, I think. And there may be another one around the same time at St. Mary's, but this one I think St. Catherine's, and it has that band. So another feature are in this and a lot of icons are bony hands. So you see bony hands on the shroud, and that feature is very reminiscent of the shroud. And then the last feature that I always like to point out, and again, find this icon. It's easy to find on the web. Find this icon and look at the neck, there's a bulge at the neck. And if you look at the shroud, there's a bulge at the neck on the shroud. And so analysts of the shroud today think that's not part of the body, it's where the cloth was caught up under the neck. But the artist included it as a feature of the icon, and all the icons after that also include that.
Yeah, I like the other two that I like are the hair tufts at the part, and I like the pulled. There's a notch out of the beard, and the notch out of
Yes,
the beard is not in the center of the chin; it's off to the side, and which is part of what's in the Bible is the beard was pulled and potentially pulled out by the Roman guards at the time.
yes, yes, those early icons, it's hard if you look at them enough and you really study the features, you would be hard pressed to say that they weren't representing the same thing. And in fact, I would propose that those early icons were actually painted from the shroud.
Yeah, yeah. And the
So,
earliest one that I've seen is from the 390s. And it's not a painting or a mosaic, it's an inlaid marble. And You may have seen it. It's got these, I call them the googly eyes, but it's got big eyes, which are very reminiscent of the shroud and very similar to that image that you have there. And then also it has some other features as well that on the face that resemble what the shroud looks like, or the man in the shroud looks like.
That's awesome. I'm going to go look that up.
I'll
That
send it to you.
adds to my list. So thank you. Thank you. Very good. Yeah, it's very persuasive. When you start looking at it, you really see that they compare. And in today's days where we do so much facial recognition, it's a very confident match.
Yeah, yeah.
And then,
Now, go ahead.
no, I was going to say, then there's also the coin, right? The Justinian the Second coin that has that same face and those same features.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was from, is that one the one from the 690s, I think it is, or is it the 640s? Because there's
I
one
think the
coin from,
690s is the
yeah,
best
and then there's one from the 940s. That's the Romanus, I think it is.
one. Yes. So those coins, those go back, and they're again that very persuasive match to the face. And then you've got other things. You've got the Sudarium of Oviedo. The Sudarium of Oviedo doesn't have an image, but it's got blood stains, more running blood stains. And it's widely believed to be that clot that was folded to the side in the tomb that the Gospel of John references. And so it's got the blood stains that match the blood stains on the shroud. It's got features. You can see the mouth and the nose, those features match. It's got the pollen from Jerusalem, which is, we haven't talked about that yet, but that's a very well-known fact at the shroud that there's pollen from Jerusalem, and there was also dirt that matches dirt in Jerusalem. That was also on the Sudarium. So the reason I bring that up is because the Sudarium has been in Spain since 614. So if those two cloths match, that also help put them together in early history.
Yeah, and definitely earlier than the 1350s that you were talking about when it was first really made available for the public to see and venerate and then pay homage to it, so to speak.
Mhm. Yes. And then last, there's that Prey Codex. That one's a little bit later, but it's a good one because the Prey Codex was in Budapest around 1192. And so that also is an early date. And the Budapest connection seems to connect to Constantinople. It seems there was a Hungarian royalty, a member of the royalty who for a while was being trained to be the heir in Constantinople. And so eventually this showed up there. So it seems likely that he had access not in Budapest, but in Constantinople. And
Yeah,
that
and
was a
that's
really good
Yeah,
representation.
that's a very good one. It's got a couple of interesting marks that resemble what's seen in the shroud. Now it's not quite as artistic, the drawing that's in there, but it's called an illuminated manuscript. And in there then you see the body of Jesus and also something that might resemble the cloth with the 3/1 herringbone. And then you see the poker holes, I think, as people call them. And so it's definitely something, and it's also interesting. I was researching the last couple weeks here on a bunch of references to the burial linens, written references to the burial linens from the 1100s, and there's actually quite a few. I've been surprised at how many there are as you go into them.
I can't wait until your next book comes out.
I can't wait either. I've been a month away from getting it done for like the last 2 years, so as the
It'll
more
be on the
you
top of my stack to read.
Fantastic. Well, you and I, it's about the Mandylion as we've talked about, and we have slightly different opinions as to where that came from. But nevertheless, the historical research, there is so it's hard to believe there's so much out there. And just recently, like I was saying, in the last couple of weeks, I've found so much from the 1150s to the 1190s. There's like three or four, new things that I'm working through, and there's maybe even another three or four on top of that. So
There's plenty of room for study. I think that's one of the things that the shroud does for you. It challenges our mind.
it draws you in, and then once you're consumed by it and you can't stop, you just want to learn more. That's for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
Exactly.
tell us a little bit more about the pollen and the dirt and things like that with the and the position of the body and what have you.
Yeah, so I think those are some of the wonderful gifts that for our mind on the shroud. You have this burial cloth that has this image that you have to work hard to understand and explain, but it's very detailed and very compelling. And then on top of that, with relatively modern forensics, some of this was done back in the 1970s, so it wasn't today's modern, but it was still current age, kind of. I was alive then. So it shows they did the test and they used just simple Scotch tape to check the cloth and see what might be on it. And this was before the time of all the modern crime scene investigation techniques. It was really kind of early in that process. And so it had pollen. So there wasn't a forensic database for it at the time, so they did a lot of work to study it. And I think the compelling thing is there was pollen from all over in the route that is reasonable to think that the shroud went on to get from Jerusalem to France and northern Italy. And in fact, most of the pollen that's on there is from Jerusalem. And that is, it doesn't help set the time, but it helps set the shroud in Jerusalem because it's just inconceivable that in the 1350s someone would know to get pollen from Jerusalem and sprinkle it on the cloth so someone could use Scotch tape to pull it off. That
Yeah.
would be too much.
Yeah, it is hard to believe, but I think it was Barry Schwartz that said that it would be even more miraculous for a forger to have forged all of the different aspects that are found on the shroud in the 1300s.
And then along with that, there's dirt. And the dirt, when they type the dirt, it's travertine aragonite limestone. So that's the building material in Jerusalem. It's not only in Jerusalem, but it's in Jerusalem. And then as techniques got better and they looked at the whole chemical composition of it, the fact that there is less strontium, a chemical component, than most places have, it's almost a certain fingerprint for Jerusalem. So, and that dirt was collected just like the pollen from around the cloth with sticky tape, and they found it in the area where the feet are, the area of the knees, and the area of the nose,
Yeah,
and
which
that
is in
matches that Sudarium.
right, and it's very interesting that there would be dust on the nose and on the knees. And in the Bible, there isn't really a reference to him falling, but certainly in tradition is that he fell several times on the descent to the cross on the Via Dolorosa. And certainly you would expect the dust on the feet. That's logical. And but then if he had fallen, then the way if you're being held, holding on to that cross where it might have been tied to your arms or maybe just a crossbeam, when you fall, you're going to fall first on your knees, and then you don't have your hands to protect your face, and you would fall directly on your face and hit your nose, most likely.
Exactly. And you can, on the photographic negative, you can clearly see the broken cartilage on the nose that is totally consistent with a face plant, if you
Yeah,
will, which is
but yeah, but not a broken bone. Not a broken
not a
bone shall
broken
be
bone.
found. And
Cartilage. Cartilage.
cartilage,
It was
cartilage.
lower than the bone. Yes.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly.
Right.
Yeah, so and now there has been some more modern research. So Max Fry was the original pollen. He was a criminologist, and he was the original researcher with the sticky tapes. And by the way, I've actually seen those sticky tapes, some of the ones that were taken from 1978 in Stirp. I was out at Barry's, and he's had them, and then now they're in with the Stirp, of course, but in the archives with the Stera group. And but now there's been a little bit of a loosening up on some of the conclusions that Max Fry had, um, where there's a lot. I don't know, maybe. I don't know. I guess I call it loosen up. Have you been looking at that at all?
Yeah. So I think there's been a lot of critical analysis, which is not a bad thing. It's really a good thing. And so what they're looking at is the fact that Max Fry, he was ahead of the game. There were no forensic databases on pollen when he started doing this. He was a really, really well-respected criminologist, and he knew it was a thing that you could, potentially get a lot of benefit from. So he started collecting the database. And so that's some of the criticism, is that it's not documented well enough. There are things where if it had been done the way that it's done now, we might could have even estimated age of some things. And there's debate about what would have been airborne pollen versus things that would just be touched to it potentially. But I don't think that changes the result or makes it any less credible, the path. So the path is still good. Some of the details are questioned, but I don't consider them invalid. John Jackson, in his book, uh, took the uh, took the approach that he gave confidence levels to things. So you couldn't give it the highest confidence level that it might have if it had started out with really solid technique from the very beginning, but you get at least a medium to high confidence level.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a good way to put it, is that and actually it's kind of interesting as well, in 1978 or earlier when there was scientific research being done, and then SERP, of course, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, they were using the best technology at the time. And then now, over the last almost 50 years, it's almost 2 years from now, it'll be 50 years. And the technology has gotten better, but so some of the conclusions, like Max Fry, I consider them being softened up, but the overall conclusion is that there was pollen in certain regions where most likely the shroud would have been had it been Jesus' burial cloth. And so that's kind of a really strong sign for me that there's corroboration of it being the true, authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ.
Yes. And again, going back to, and that was on the cloth in 1353, when they couldn't possibly even know it was on the cloth. That's the good thing about pollen. It's microscopic and it sticks really well. So it's there, they don't even know it. And then when you pull it off, you see you've got the majority of what you're pulling off from Jerusalem.
Yeah, that is so true and so interesting. All right, so this week is Passion Week, and Passion Week we just started with Palm Sunday and Jesus's triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and but now. Coming up on Thursday is going to be an event, another huge Christian event. And then, of course, with Monday, Thursday, or Dark Thursday, and then Friday with Good Friday, and then the what we call Good Friday, although the suffering that he went through for us. So tell us about the resurrection timeline and how all of that kind of fits in with what we understand from the Gospels and even outside of the Gospels, there's references to to the crucifixion. So tell us about that.
Yeah. So I'll start with just a few surprises from the shroud that most people probably know if they've really looked into the shroud, but when you line them all up, it's pretty impressive that it matches the gospel so well, but it goes a step further in some ways to give us insight. So the first one is the scourging. So we know from the gospel that Jesus was scourged, and we see, and when you realize what you're looking at and see the magnitude of the scourge marks on the body, it really gives pause. They are deep clotted wounds, according to the medical people who have looked at them in detail. They're clotted blood. They're made from metal balls. You can see the pattern. You can see it was two consistent scourges that did most of the wounds. Teams have counted 372 wounds of that deep clotted blood nature that you can count, and we don't see the sides of the body. So there were probably 600 wounds. So the severity of the scourging. Sometimes you'll hear people say that there was a law limiting the number of lashes. Oh, well, there was for the Jews, but there wasn't for the Romans. So that's sometimes a surprise that you see in the shroud. And then we have the cap style crown of thorns because you can see that there's blood. They've counted about 30 to 50 wounds, depending on who counts, coming from the crown of the head as well as the sides. So that cap style crown of thorns also is worse than the circlet that we often see. You mentioned the crossbar, so carrying the cross. So carrying the cross on the shoulders after he'd been already injured with the scourging would have been very difficult. And you mentioned the fall, that evidence from the dirt on the knees and the nose, as well as the feet, that looks like it came. And the estimate is that that crossbar would weigh somewhere between 75 and 125 pounds. So it would be very, very easy to imagine how bad that was. And then, am I missing anything? No, and the wound, so wound, a spear wound. I think the spear wound is one of those things that jumps out at you because, well, let's do nails first in sequence. Nails. So the wound's not through the middle of the palm, it's through probably the most likely place is the meaty part of the palm and out the wrist. And most medical folks now, especially a lot of carpal tunnel doctors, say that that would be the place that would secure it the best. And then we had the spear wound that we see in the side. So we know that was after death, according to the Gospel of John. And we've always had that beautiful imagery in John of blood and water flowing from the wound. And when you look at the shroud, we that speaks to us. It speaks to Jesus' blood flowing for us. It speaks to the water of our baptism as we choose him and follow him. What it also does when you look at it on the shroud is it tells the medical folks that that is the Gospel of John described it exactly right. That it was what you see on the shroud is blood and water. And what the medical experts say is that shows that it was after death, it pierced the heart, the blood that had a path to flow flowed out of the heart, but also all the fluid that was built up from struggling on the cross poured out as well. So you get that blood and water flowing. So that I think is a very significant image. And then you mentioned the resurrection timeline. So, one of the things as they recreated the image and figured out how the body was wrapped in the shroud, and you can do that because there's really detailed information, including three-dimensional information in the shroud. Once you see how the body was postured, you can tell that the body was not laying flat. The head and shoulders were up, and the knees were up, and the feet were up. And that most people think that that is because the body was still in rigor mortis when the image was made. So that rigor mortis, the arms were not in the position on the cross, they were repositioned, but that can be done early in the process of rigor mortis. So they think rigor mortis it begins gradually when he was on the cross. And then he was still in that position though when the image was made. So what that does to set the timeline for the resurrection is rigor mortis lasts for about 40 hours. So if you look at the timeline from 3 o'clock Friday, when most people think Jesus died, to early morning Sunday, Easter Sunday, that's 36 to 39 hours. So that fact that the body's still in rigor mortis gives us a tie to that image being made around the time of the resurrection.
Yeah, it's interesting. I and Teddy Pappas has done a lot on rigor
She
mortis, and I think she
has.
calls it liver mortis, and it's fascinating to read. I always wondered if it's also possible that the so Nicodemus had 75 pounds
Mhm.
of myrrh and aloes, burial spices, and I always wondered whether that was laid underneath the body, so that that would maintain the position of the body, and also push the cloth up against, in particular, against the back of the legs, because unless it was tied very tightly around his legs, then there would not be necessarily an image as clear as it is on the back of the legs. So for me, it would seem like they stuffed it somehow to make sure that the cloth was relatively close to the legs, the back of the legs, so that the image, when it was made, corresponds to other aspects of the image, which is it's darker where it's closer to the skin,
Mhm.
and lighter where it's further away. So you have the nose is very dark where you would imagine that the cloth would lay over the nose and over the cheeks and then over the hair. I don't know, any thoughts
That's
about that?
possible. So the only thing I'll say is it would have to be, I think, it would have to be really almost constructed to be as consistent as it is in the image, because the image is very, you don't have a gap in the image.
Mm,
And the other thing that I think speaks to rigor mortis is if you look at the back part of the body, I hate to say it this way, but the bottom is not flattened, it's rounded. And that also is consistent with rigor mortis.
mm,
So it could be both. I like the, I've one of the theories about that myrrh and aloe being packed around. I've heard theories about it being mostly on the sides of the body. Since we don't see the sides of the body, maybe that was there blocking the image being made on the side. But it could be, there's so many things, there's so
Yeah.
much possibility. What I love about the shroud is you've got things that are so, persuasively connected with Jesus and the crucifixion and the resurrection. And then you've got so many details that you can continue to work to put in place. But
Right.
so to me, that rigor mortis timeline being so coincident with the resurrection is a gift to me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm
Well,
inclined that way. Yeah.
yeah. And actually, it's also interesting. One of the, and maybe it's a surprise as well, but or a gift as well, is that uh, I think it's in John where they do talk about the burial spices being brought by Nicodemus and then surrounding or somehow around the body somehow. And there's
That's all they
actually,
meant. All they mention is just they brought them.
yeah,
So
no,
so everything after that is our trying to figure out what happened to them.
yeah. Well, but there's in some of the research that I've been doing is there's this gentleman Nicholas Meserides, and he was the person in charge of the relics in the 12th century, and he claims that the burial cloth still had the scent, a very mild, very, very mild scent,
Okay.
1200 years later of myrrh.
Hmm.
And so then there is potentially that as evidence that that scent is still there.
Hmm.
It would be
That's
fascinating to hopefully at some point have a repeat of doing some research to see if there's any particles of myrrh anywhere that, or whatever, or however, whether that scent is still there, even in a very, very
mhm.
faint, or even in a faintness that only, the strongest of and most sensitive of instruments could pick out, to then, and have another proof point or evidence point that says that here was that it does correspond with what you see in the Gospels.
Yes, yes, because so far not a lot of evidence for myrrh was found.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I hate talking about the dating of the linen because it always brings up the carbon 14 radiocarbon testing and dating. And but anyway, let's go for it, and we'll start there. All right, well,
So
have at it. I'm looking forward to it.
okay, so I'm going to say let's talk about the dating. So first, I want to talk about the evidence that it looks like first century linen. I want to talk about the evidence that it's first century linen. So the first thing I'll say is that expert um, fabric people have said it looks like first century linen. And to back that up, when they were looking for linen for the carbon 14 test, they were looking for control samples from the 13th, 14th century that looked like the shroud linen, and they did not find any. And so there's more errors in the weaving. The shroud linen is thought to be a very, very fine linen, like priestly garment worthy linen. Even today, it's still beautiful linen, but it had more errors in the weaving. Some report that with all the observation that they have observed banding in it. Banding is almost like dye lot variations in fabrics today where the color varies. And that you would see that in first century linen, but not in 13th, 14th century. And it came from the way the flax was processed. And that's very well understood and described by, I think, Pliny the Elder. So it looks like first century linen. So there are 5 dating tests that look at kind of the overall character of the linen and how it's aged over time. And they look at things like fiber strength. How long can you pull a fiber before it breaks? And there are some fibers that they were able to test that with. They use different technology to look overall at the structure and look at other chemicals in the linen that break down over time and give you a different look. If you look at 20th century BC versus first century AD versus 12th versus 15th century. So you can compare it to linens over time, and it will have a characteristic difference. So all five of those dating techniques that look at linen in that way say that it's consistent with first century. And the latest, so they all have a little more variation than the 150 years or so that carbon 14 reported. But the latest date that they give with all their variation is 800 AD. And they all say it's very probable that it could be first century. So I think that's really persuasive. Then there's a strip across the top of the linen that is the same material as the shroud, but it was sewn back on. And there's been speculation. I'd be interested in seeing what you think about that top strip. Some people think maybe it was the strip that they used to secure it. Some people think that to get the perfect, what is it, 8x2 or cubit piece of material, that was a strip that they sewed on. Anyway, it's sewn on with a stitch called a Z-stitch that fabric experts have found one match to this Z-stitch. And it was from a cloth that was recovered from the Masada that was also a first century cloth. So everything about the linen looks like first century. And then you've got carbon 14 that's an outlier. So carbon 14 has been discredited I think we're going kind of easy on them because it was clearly they knew that they had an invalid test. It should have been called inconclusive, and they hid data and reported it anyway. And the bottom line is that their test showed that they weren't testing a cohesive object and that there was contamination of some sort. So there's two theories on contamination. One of them is, quote, modern fibers, like 13th, 14th century fibers got mixed in there. Joe Marino has done a lot of work on that, and that's potentially a valid possibility. And then the other possibility is that there was something else that added carbon 14 back to the test. I think that also, back to the cloth, I think that also is a very valid consideration. And it sounds like a cop-out or kind of wild, but there's reasons based on kind of the pattern of the measurements of the individual carbon 14 tests. But irregardless, the carbon 14 dates don't give you a valid estimate of the age.
Yeah, and I think the one thing even and Giulio Fanti's come up with a new hypothesis based on some data that he's found is that the cloth is radioactive.
Right.
And that was not
Yeah.
tested for the radiocarbon dating. And if that was not tested for, then that would also invalidate the carbon 14 testing. So there's other reasons in addition to that, plus the statistics and other things that invalidate the work that was done with the radiocarbon testing.
Yes. and that's that kind of new, some kind of energy or something affected it that would change the carbon-14 profile. And that's not easy to come up with exactly how it happened, but we're dealing with something that's not easy to explain with natural methods right now. So there's research still.
Yeah, and it's a one-time event. So as far as we know anyway, it's a one-time
Right.
event. And so how do you something that happened 2000 years ago, how do we figure out what happened 2000 years ago when the only evidence we have is this cloth that has other evidence on it, but it doesn't necessarily have the evidence on it as to exactly what that miraculous supernatural process was that where the body was became mechanically transparent.
That's what the science leads you to anyway. Yeah.
Yeah,
There,
yeah,
that's why I think that's what still keeps people studying it.
yeah. So, what other ways do you think that what other dating methods have you come across?
So there are, like I mentioned, there are all that those techniques that test fiber strength. So it's checking tensile strength in the fiber. There's one test that vanillin, maybe, that's a
Vanillin and the
component of
lignin.
fiber.
Yep.
Yeah, yes,
Ray
yes, yes.
Rogers. Yep.
Yes, so that was one of the early ones. And then there's been a Fourier test. And again, what you're looking at there is you're using technology to look at the character of it. And then you compare the character of it and try to match what age linen that you're looking at. And the supposition is that parts of the linen are deteriorating over time, and you're going to put them kind of in categories. So some of the tests might have a 400-year window, some of them might have a 1,000-year window, but when they did the calculations, none of them went any later than 800 AD.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. So and then of course there's the new one, the Wax S. Tell us about that one.
So that one again is very similar. I think they're using new I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on there. They're using new technology that really hasn't been done before. So it's a little bit of it to me, it doesn't have the error bounds on it is really tight. But that's because they made some assumptions that about the conditions that it were kept in that let them compare it in a very detailed way. So it again, it's using X-ray technology and looking at the cloth and the character of it and comparing cloths of different ages. So it's the newest of all those type techniques, and I think it's the one that the error band is probably too tight. But I think they will continue to improve that.
Mm.
They've got a good line there. They'll continue to improve it.
Yeah, well, and even, back in '88 when the carbon-14 testing was still in its infancy, it was early, and people kind of thought of it as being the gold standard of testing. And yet, when it was tested, when the shroud material was tested using that, then they still made a ton of mistakes, including the radioactivity, including, whether they properly cleaned the material and whether they took into account that it was potentially radioactive. So,
Yeah.
and then they hid it. I mean, it took a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, to actually get the true data to be able to then really understand how they potentially, and who knows whether it was on purpose or not, but how
It
they,
was.
yeah,
It had to be.
well, we as authenticists think it was on purpose, but
Yeah.
nevertheless,
I think I
how
had to be.
yeah,
As a
I
scientist who does test, you don't do that and then shove the test in the drawer. That is not
yeah,
good. That is the worst of science. It
yeah,
is the worst.
exactly. You know, and it's funny, Joe Marino's got a paper coming out, or I think it may already be out about, the lack of, I guess, ethics in science nowadays, especially as it relates to the shroud.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And that's really, I think that's why it's so hard to find. When you look in the web, on the web, to try to find things, it's very, very confusing.
yeah, yeah.
So
Well, and
thanks to
you
you,
end up getting both sides, and how do
which
you,
is,
get the wheat from the straw, so to speak.
yeah, and hopefully people don't make their decisions from just whether they like what they hear, but go search for those books that help try to convey the recent
Yeah.
truth.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so one more thing, and let's talk about the image itself and some of the
Yes.
really funky different, things that are related to that image. And so let's talk about that.
Yeah, I'd love to end with this because it's what leads you to the resurrection. So the image itself is that very, very strange thing. When you look at it in the natural view, it's just a vague image, and you look at it and think it could be anything. People would, I'm sure, first speculate it could be oils from the body. It could who it could be a lot of different things. But when you look at that very detailed photographic negative, that's what kicked off the science frenzy and the understanding that this is not like anything else, and it is not just a vague image. It is a detailed image that is hidden there on the cloth. And so I'll try to go through this pretty quickly because it's hard. It's hard to get your head around. So I don't want to overload, but I want to tempt people to go look it up and start studying it. So I'll go through what I think are the key characteristics that get you through the image and understanding how strange it is. So the first one is the superficiality, the fact that it is only on just the very surface of the cloth, meaning one thread has about 200 fibers, and only the top one or two fibers have any color in them of the image. You could scrape it off with a razor blade, and the image would be gone, and you would still have the linen cloth. So that superficial nature of it is part of the key characteristic. So chemists say it's one color. It is one color that it looks like those top little fibers were dehydrated. They say dehydrated and oxygenated. In other words, something affected those fibers. Well, again, that could be a lot of things. So let's go to the next step. So the next part of the image is the photographic negative effect. And that's where everybody says, whoa, that's like nothing that we've ever seen before. And that's true. There is nothing else in the world that has that effect of having that vague image and giving you all the detail that's in the photographic negative. But what gives you that is that superficial marking on the linen and the fact that it codes the body in so much detail, but you only really see the detail when you look at it with the photographic negative. So that's the strangeness. Then the third thing is there's also three-dimensional information in it. And that is that things that were closer to the shroud, like if you imagine having the cloth over your head, your nose is going to be touching it. So the nose is dark, the eyes are light, but they all have image area. And if you plot it, the dark things up, the light things down, you get a really well resolved body image that looks just like that picture for us. So that three-dimensional is the third strange thing. And then what flows from that is the fourth observation, which is that parts of the body that were close to the shroud, within about a half an inch, but not touching it, contribute to the image. In other words, it's not just where the body was touching the cloth, it's where the body was within about a half an inch from it on the front and the back. And it's that when you start thinking through, well, how could that have happened? You've got to convince yourself first that it did happen, and it's solid. Many people have shown that, and there's great books that you can get that talk about that. So it's solid that parts of the body that were not touching the cloth contribute to the image. So that leads you to radiation, radiated energy. And that's where kind of science says, whoa, okay, we know radiated energy, right? That's the natural phenomenon. Microwaves cook our food and we get sunburned, and X-rays image our body. But this is energy in the form of the body, because that's what is marked on the inside of the cloth. And the only thing on the inside of the cloth was the body, and that's what marked the cloth. So that's where science, you're getting into what you referred to, Guy, as that one time event. This isn't a normal thing. Looks supernatural, and science doesn't have a means to describe that. You can describe up to it, and that I heard you mention earlier the disappearing body theory. So the theory is the body's wrapped in the shroud. It's the moment of the resurrection, and the body's not solid anymore. And that is consistent with Jesus as we see him move through locked doors in his glorified body. We see him appear and disappear and not look like himself, and then be solid and show the wounds. So it's consistent with the glorified body for it to just disappear out of the cloth. And then the cloth drops, the energy marks the cloth, and all those blood clots and the wounds and the blood are left in place on the cloth.
Yeah, it is pretty astounding. And one other thing that I found as well with the shroud is when you get close to it, you can't see the image. You have to be
Yeah,
standing back 4, 5, 6 feet to be able to for your eye to be able to perceive it, which is almost, which makes it also almost impossible to forge, to paint an image like that, because you would have to be standing 6 feet away trying to paint that image and being able to then see the face, but when you get up close you can't see it.
yeah.
And so all of what you're talking about, the photographic negative properties, the dimensionality, the superficiality, and what have you, are just amazing, and all of those are clearly mysteries that it would be nice to be able to solve, but I don't know if we as man will ever be able to.
No, but I'm still going to keep up with it and try.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. Well, before we close, we've been going over a little bit of an hour, but before we close, anything else you'd like to mention?
No, I do encourage people, look for an exhibit. That's a great way to talk to other people who are interested in the shroud and see a different view of it. And there are a couple of notable ones around. If you go to othonia.org, they've got a list of speakers and exhibits that are going around, and my exhibits are usually, you can find them on that othonia.org. And they're building a really great website, so it'll be a good deal. And then in addition, the National Shroud of Turin has now an exhibit for the next 6 months in Orlando at the Basilica there. And it is a beautiful exhibit, really well done. And so I would encourage everybody, if especially if you're in the Orlando area, go look at the exhibit and the prayer garden, a beautiful prayer garden that's there in the Basilica.
Yeah, that I definitely want to get to. There's also a an exhibit, a permanent exhibit in California with Athonia.
Oh, oh
And
my goodness, I forgot that one. I've seen that one. Have you been yet?
not yet, not yet. It's on
I
my bucket
I
list.
It is wonderful. I can't believe I forgot that one. So it is an immersive experience. So they have a beautiful exhibit at the end that you can kind of take in on your own time. And they've also got an immersive experience where they have brought to life parts of Jesus' ministry, kind of ending with the story that leads to the shroud. And it is a wonderful, beautifully well done thing.
Yeah, yeah, definitely looking forward to seeing both of those. There was a an exhibit in Washington, D.C. at the Museum of the Bible, and it was immensely popular. One of the most popular events that the and exhibits that the Museum of the Bible had. So definitely looking forward to the Florida exhibit with the national, what is it called? The National Shroud of Turin exhibit.
Yeah, it's a man that my head has gone blank for the name of the basilica. The basilica is hosting this National Shroud of Turin exhibit for 6 months. And
Mm.
Myra Adams curated it, and it is a beautiful, beautiful job. It's a wonderful experience.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. Well, Pam, thank you. I we've got a break here, but you've been awesome, and you those 5 or 6 bullets that we went through are just perfect to understand the history, the science, the controversy of the dating, and then the fascinating aspects of the image itself. Just fantastic. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Very good. It's always good to talk to you, Guy.
Yeah, you too. So, and for the audience, of course, please stay tuned for many other videos in this series on the backstory of the Shroud of Turin. And if you can, go visit guypowell.com and take a look at my book, The Only Witness. And I think you'll find some interesting reading there, fast reading. It's a historical fiction and it traces the history or a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2,000 years. Pam, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Guy. See you soon.